Let's jump into some render passes in Mudbox. So I'm going to step up. Oh, let's go to my layers here. I have my pose layer here, and let's just grab a paintbrush. Step up to our level that we were working with, our top level here. So a couple things I should point out that I'm taking advantage of here in Mudbox is my framing of this character with his pose. I've stored in the camera bookmarks, I've made a camera bookmark here that will pose him the way I want to pose him to get for my final render. So the way that we can work with this here is to create a bunch of render passes directly out of Mudbox. I'm working with Photoshop to do the comp, to assemble the image from the render passes that I generate here. So if we jump over to our comp in Photoshop, the first thing that I start with is just a render of the whole thing completely out of Mudbox. You can see I have a ground plane in there. So the ground plane I'm using here is just a simple plane created in Mudbox. The shadow is on there, and there's a couple things that we can do with that shadow we'll take a look at a little bit later on. So it's a good idea just to go ahead and grab a render of your entire thing. You can start to set up your viewport filters, tone map it by all means. You use the ambient occlusion in Mudbox 2011 Subscription Advantage Pack. Use the cavity ambient occlusion in there as well. You can get both effects actually in the 2011 version pre-Subscription Advantage Pack. And versions forward you could toy with that to get some of the same effects I'm working with here. But what we're going to do is let's start off with a couple of these little things. So I showed you how we can do a save screen image. We can select where we want to save those images, set it to your directory of passes where you want to do that. Let's turn off our floor plane here and just work with what we have in here. So a couple of the passes that are useful in doing this. If you go to the display menu, you can turn on flat lighting. And this is a great way to get just a simple flat RGB pass, right? Just a simple flat diffuse pass. So that's a useful one. I definitely go ahead and grab that. And in the screen image menu here, you'll see save with transparency. So if you're not using any complex viewport filters layered on there, and you have save with transparency, and you save it as a PNG format or anything that can store an alpha. I usually use PNGs, they work great. It will actually write this out for you so you have it alpha'd out. You won't have the black or the gradient background in there as well. So an RGB pass, definitely a flat RGB pass is great. We looked at the beauty pass there, so we'll just turn that back on. Just a basic beauty pass. In my comp I used a couple different variations of the beauty pass. One with spec on there, one without, one with some tone mapping, one without, and one that's just essentially flat without any specularity on there. We can turn that off back in our paint layers here. So you can just turn the whole specular off. I have a bunch of different passes in here. I just put a solid black layer in there and just called it spec off. And we can render out a simple beauty pass to use for comping in. Some other cool ones that we can work with here. With ambient occlusion in the Subscription Advantage Pack 2011, you'll see that there's this different ambient occlusion. In 2011, if you go to the menu, in the new filter menu, there is like a screen space AO viewport filter, like an NVIDIA-based viewport filter that you can grab and pull down. The settings I'm using in this ambient occlusion here, I've got the cast and the directions cranked up as high as I can go on there. The cast length I've brought down to 12. I've put the darkness level down on this. And to preview what you're seeing, use this only ambient occlusion button here. And this actually works out really nice just to be able to preview what let's turn these actually, yeah, turn that one on. Just preview your ambient occlusion in there. So a couple little tricks that I'm using in here. If I use that preview button, I can see what my ambient occlusion is doing on there, and I'll leave that on and hit render, save screen image, my full res. Again, I'm doing a really large image I'm working with here. I'm using a 5500 width for my final render. So you can, that's the nice thing about the render pass here. You can crank it up to the highest res that you want. Save that image. So this is just a general ambient occlusion pass. And another nice little trick, if we turn on cavity ambient occlusion, while we're in this ambient occlusion, only ambient occlusion clicked on, you'll see that we get those doubled up on there as well. So not a bad idea to grab both of those doubled up. And then with that displayed, tweak your settings here, of course, to what you want. Go back to the ambient occlusion pass and take the darkness and put it down to 0. And now you're only getting that cavity ambient occlusion pass. So there's the ambient occlusion with it turned right down to 0. There's nothing there. And here's that cavity, or in 2011, the regular ambient occlusion I'm using on there. It's basically the same thing there. You're getting this cavity ambient occlusion pass on here. So that's kind of a nice way to grab two different ambient occlusion passes, and as well, again, turn your level of the darkness of the ambient occlusion on, and you can get a third one out, which is the two of them doubled up. So as well with that, let's turn that off. A couple other really useful passes in here. If we jump back to our paint layers, I have on the very top of my diffuse layer, see I'm working with so many different layers of diffuse maps in there, just a simple black. So if I click that on and just make my character fully opaque black, then I've gone into my specular here and I can turn spec off, and I'm using this to create a spec pass. And if I use the different layers I have in here, I can get a variety of different specular passes, and I can tweak how tight I want the spec, right? So in the final comp, just to go into where's my Photoshop here. In the final comp there, I actually use a couple of different spec passes on there. So I use one that's kind of a broader fall off, and then a second one that's a little tighter on some of the details. And all we're doing on there, if we put this one here and display this one, is I'm using a linear dodge, an add. So I'm just adding that to that so you can see the different effect on there. And then a couple of other nice little passes to use. Let's turn that off. You could actually do the same technique I'm doing here if you have a reflectivity channel. The exact same thing. Put black, use a reflectivity channel, turn everything else off, and get that nice reflective pass going in there. So another couple of things here in the viewport filters, we have the ability in Mudbox to display a normal preview. I always grab one of these. I always grab a normal map pass. So again, save screen image on that, grab a normal pass on there. And the reason why I do that is you can grab the channels, right? Sometimes you'll find, especially if you're doing something with skin, human skin, things like that, grabbing the blue channel, and things like this, maybe grabbing the green channel is nice just to kind of blend or multiply that in and work with that channel kind of overall just to give different color variation on your creature. It's a useful thing to use for a lot of different effects and compositing there. And then as well, another really handy one to have here is the screen distance, which if used by the default, you can use this as a Z depth or a Z depth pass and use that for fog effects or for depth of field compositing as well. So I definitely go ahead and grab a Z depth pass. I have that in my Photoshop thing. And then while I'm in here, I always want to grab just a solid white opaque alpha, and a quick way to do that is with the screen distance filter. And a way to do that is I just quickly I invert the white level to -1. You can crank the black level up to whatever you want to get it solid opaque, and I'll render that one out there as simply put alpha, and then I'll use that as my layer mask to create my layer mask in Photoshop as well. And one last one we'll take a look at. It's quite infinite what you can do with these passes, especially with the power of a compositing package, the power of the layers in Photoshop. You can actually take difference passes between two different things, right? So another pass I'll show you in Photoshop is I did a simple HDR pass, and I use that as kind of a lighting pass for my comp there as well. If we turn the plane on, and in the Mudbox 2011 subscription Advantage Pack and versions forward, if I jump into my material, you'll see that we have opacity, which is paintable in Mudbox. And what you can do in this this version here, make this guy completely opaque. I'm going to turn the spec off. Oops, let's just turn that specularity, and there, turn that right off. And you can see I can use this to generate a floor shadow path. So quick way to get a simple floor shadow pass, bring that into Photoshop, have that masked out, matted out, comped or blended out, and then you can use that to tweak it as well. With that, if I go into my ambient occlusion and turn the opacity, actually we don't need opacity on. If I have the floor on, you'll see that I get some nice ambient occlusion off the character on the floor, and that's a useful pass to have as well. Matte your character out, of course, and use the floor ambient occlusion on there. So you can use your alpha as a reveal mask to grab that as well. So in Photoshop here, just really quickly, here are my different little passes that we're looking with here. You can see I'm working with a large image size. Again, here I'm working with that huge width and height that I was able to render out. So all these different passes in here, I'm using those to comp together to get a bunch of different effects. The ambient occlusion, the best way to work with that, of course, is to multiply that in, and you can do that on your pass there. There's the overall one there. And this layer set, I don't have the alpha using as a mask here, but you would definitely grab that, use that as a mask for your composite in there. So that's just a quick overview. There's my Z depth there. That's just a quick overview of how you can grab a bunch of useful, handy render passes right out of Mudbox. The final image used in the comp in the tutorial is completely rendered out of Mudbox and then composited here in Photoshop.